America's Social Injustice and Mental Health Crisis. This webinar is presented by Ben Ramsey, Bronwyn Franklin, Mariah Williams, and Kurt Johnson. Before we begin the presentation, I would like you to please take a minute to watch the video that I will be sharing in the chat shortly. It is about 40 seconds long, so once you have watched the video, we will come back and start the presentation. Thank you very much.
What do we have? 330 registered. We'll find out. It's done.
Okay, thank you everyone for watching the video. Now we will pass it to the presenters. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm really excited to hear from you all.
Thank you, C.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Ramsey, and I would like to welcome you once again to Discarded American. If we could go to the next slide. If we go to the next slide, please. Rowan, can we go to the next slide, please? There we go. So it's Discarded America, Rural America's. Go back one, please. We'll get this straightened out very shortly, I promise all of you. Rural America, go to the next one. There we go. Rural America's Social Injustice and Mental Health Crisis. Now, when we first started talking about this project, it's a documentary project that we've been talking about and been putting into different phases since August of last year. I got really excited because I personally grew up in rural America. I grew up in Western North Carolina with a mental illness. I had family members with mental illnesses, and I got to see the stigmatizing and the discrimination that was there. And as we started doing this, some research, I found out there's as many people in rural America with mental illnesses as there are in cities and urban areas. And if we could go to the next slide, please. This shows access to mental health care ranking, and this is 2020. And if you can see there, the highest ranking states with mental health care is in yellow, and the darkest there in green are those with the lowest. Now, since moving to, I live now in St. Paul, Minnesota. Since moving to Minnesota, I've had excellent care for my mental health. I have a psychiatrist, I have a therapist. Anytime I need treatment, I give them a call and I'm in within the first 10 days. My mom, on the other hand, she still lives in Western North Carolina, and she's lost some people, been in grief, a lot of depression, suicidal ideation, and I got her talked into going to see a psychiatrist and a therapist. What blew my mind was, to see a psychiatrist, she had to wait 3 months. She's not seeing a psychiatrist until March. And a therapist, she got in to see one, but was told because of scheduling, and since she was the only therapist in that area under my mom's insurance, she could only see her once every 4 to 6 weeks, which is a disgrace. And this happens all over the United States in rural places. There's just not enough mental health care. to access all the people with mental health problems. And next slide. And with this, I'll turn it over to Brawlin.
Good afternoon, good morning. Hello, everybody. I am Bronwyn Franklin, and the reason why we decided we really wanted to do something on this level is because we really wanted to take a deeper look into some of the injustices and the marginalization that's going on in communities all across America. And when we started to look at this, we started to realize that rural America has fallen behind most areas, you know, on the social justice, racial, and mental health fields. So and as we dug a little deeper, we found that, you know, the actual trainings and people that's involved, such as law enforcement, early childhood educators, are not getting the training, getting the knowledge, or getting the skills in order to help individuals. And as Ben kind of talked about, you know, the access is not really there. So we thought about, you know, how do we as a group of people who have lived experience move forward and bring some education, some awareness to what's going on in rural America. We decided that we wanted to start trying to put together a documentary on this. And the documentary would be, you know, what it looks like for law enforcement now. How are they being trained now, you know, and what changes and knowledge and skills would be more helpful to helping them when they're working with people who have trauma and mental health challenges, you know, training such as ECPR or understanding Healing Voices network, and learning different types of skills that's coming from that, because we also realize that law enforcement carries their own set of traumas as well. And learning how to not allow their traumas to be activated when they're working with someone who's in a trauma state. We also wanted to look at early childhood educators, because our children are growing up in a school system and they spend more hours, they spend a third of their day with educators in a school system. They're 8 hours a day, you know, and then they're home 8 hours a day, and then they're sleeping. So they're getting a lot of their education, their taught, their interaction with the world and each other, and from early childhood educators. And a lot of our young people are, and I'm a product of Detroit Public Schools, and we're not learning how to. We weren't learning how to help a child deal with their feelings when they're having strong feelings or emotions, or there's some sort of trauma or something going on in the home that's the child is having an unmet need. Early educators aren't trained to recognize that or to see that or how to support that young person. And that's sad, because this is our future. So if we don't help our children, what's going to happen? And then the next piece was we wanted politicians and leaders to be able to back trainings and help fund trainings and change laws and policies that will help affect everybody. So with the documentary, we decided we would use, we wanted to break it down into like 3 doable parts. One part would be to set it up into like 3 half-hour educational and informative type videos. And after that, we would take the whole 90 minutes and put it together and be able to show it in film festivals and schools of learning and so forth and so on, and use it as a tool for teaching as well. And again, we hope it would be a useful tool for helping legislators change policies and make changes on that level. So in this picture, you see that it has become, these are some very famous people. I'm pretty sure you've recognized faces on here that you know, and maybe even love, who have started to share and talk about their own experiences with mental health challenges. Okay, I'm not sure what's okay. Here we go. So we felt that, it's timely. This is time. It's time for us to start talking about this. We have been trying to remove the stigma of mental health for quite a long time. And with all those celebrities that we just looked at starting to speak up, some of those walls are coming down. Some of those chips are coming down because these are very respected, notable people that's sharing their stories in the sports arenas, in the movie, in Hollywood, across the world. But again, they have the resources. Rural America is not finding the resources that they need to help individuals who are having the mental health challenges. We have also noticed that since we have been in this pandemic of COVID-19, mental health cases has risen because there's more isolation. People weren't designed to be isolated without other individuals. So there's already a challenge there. And in rural America, you're already isolated in that area. Rural America, sometimes your nearest neighbor might be a half a mile down the road, so there's more isolation, as we all know. And with COVID, we have even more isolation. And as we've all heard, mental health crisis has increased, as well as the COVID cases. Another reason why we found this to be timely is we have now moved into the Biden administration, and they have started quite a few mental health initiatives. And right now they're working around $2.5 billion that's been allocated to mental health and addiction crisis. So this is another time that we need to speak up and let it be known that rural America is falling behind and falling through the cracks. And then the final reason why we decided that we thought it was timely is the social justice issues that's been going across America for the last couple of years. And there needs to be more diversity and activism in people, and looking at the systems that are in place right now, because people of diverse backgrounds, LGBTQIA plus, Blacks, people of color, indigenous people, are, especially in rural America, are definitely being impacted greatly at this point in time. So these are the reasons why we felt that we wanted to put together this webinar and take this into the next level, into a documentary. And now I'm going to pass it back to Ben.
Hi, everybody. This is Ben again. This slide shows the challenges to the provision of mental health services in rural communities. As I was talking a little bit before about
We're not
accessibility.
hearing you. Are you there?
I am. Can you not hear me still?
I can hear you, Ben.
Okay. So I'll start again.
Can't hear you, Ben.
These are the challenges to the provision of mental health services in rural communities. As I was talking a little bit before about my mom, how long it was going to take her to see a psychiatrist.
Ben, we're not hearing you.
Still not hearing me.
No, we're hearing you, Ben.
One of you's hearing him and one of you's not.
Okay, I am unmuted now.
But you were unmuted. You're fine. Mariah could hear you. Just keep going.
The accessibility in a lot of rural areas, like the psychiatrist my mom can see in March, almost an hour away. So she's going to have to drive almost an hour just to get to that psychiatrist that she couldn't see for 3 months. And that happens a lot. That happens a whole lot in rural America, where there's so few providers. And within those few providers, even fewer of them may take your insurance. So that accessibility is huge. The availability. The number of mental health professionals in rural areas are so low, are so diverse, that sometimes you could live in a community and not have anyone whatsoever except perhaps your church or your primary care physician be available to you. Then there's the case of affordability. What if you do have a psychiatrist that's close by, but you can't afford them? The insurance copay is too high, or they aren't even covered under your insurance. So a lot of times people just don't go because they can't afford it. And the last thing, and I think this is huge in a lot of communities, is acceptability. I grew up with a mental health disorder and I was constantly told to get over it, not to be a baby. The devil's got you. You know, I had many times when there were prayers prayed over me instead of taking me to get professional help. And even though I believe in prayer, I do believe that certain things are necessary. And one of those things that are necessary is mental health services. Now, this next slide shows the steps of recovery for mental illness and substance abuse. One of the things that we couldn't figure out when we first started was, why is there so much more legislation and money going into substance abuse than mental health in a lot of places? Because as you see here, both of them have 5 steps to recovery, but yet those things I listed on the previous slide that made it a impasse for some people to get mental health services, the easiest thing for them to do if they can't see a psychiatrist or afford their medicine is to start drinking, start taking drugs. And that happens so much. Where if we can get those 3 major areas that Braun was talking about previously, the law enforcement, the early childhood, and legislators on board with passing mental health legislation and putting more money into that, I think we would see a lot fewer people having to revert to substance abuse, having to revert to living a life as an alcoholic or a drug addict simply because they can't deal with the symptoms they have being mentally ill. Next slide. Next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide? Now this and the next few slides has a lot of data, a lot of statistics, and I'm not going to sit here and read it to you because I've been to enough webinars to know that somebody just reading off of a slide with a bunch of statistics is really boring. But I do on this one want to show you, this is healthcare providers. This is all healthcare providers. And look at this. Total physicians per 10,000 people in a rural area is only 13. In an urban area, that's 33. And if you remember earlier, I said that there's as many people with mental illness living in rural areas, it's been found, as lives in urban areas. But those 13 physicians, only 1 or 2 of them may even be a psychiatrist. And in some communities, none of them are psychiatrists. And if you look down here at the bottom right-hand corner, you see that a lot of, get back one here, on the previous slide, you saw that that there was a lot of hospitals that closed down between 2010 and 2019. And I have to ask myself, where did those people go? Those people with mental illness that were just discharged from a hospital because it closed, well, most of them ended up in jail, or on drugs, or drinking. This next slide shows the youth mental health crisis in rural communities. And if you look there on the right side, you'll see that compared to urban areas, rural youth under 20 years old are 4 to 6 times more likely to commit suicide. And that's a shame. That's something that we've got to change. The middle slide there shows why rural mental health in America really matters. And you see those statistics there. And finally, on that slide, rural families and mental health. A greater proportion of rural families spend 6 hours more a week coordinating their children's care than in urban areas. So if a child has a mental illness, the parent may not even have the time to find the mental health services that that child needs. So these things are very, very important. And all these slides are going to be available to you to download, to look over yourself after this presentation. And let's go to the next slide, please. Go to the next slide. Next slide.
You said, bro.
There we go. And we saw here earlier where I was talking about a lot of people with mental illness are in the criminal justice system. And that is so, so sad. And if you see down there where it says access to care, you see that 45% there. Look at what that says. That says less than half of the people with the history of mental illness receive any type of mental health treatment while held in a local jail. So if someone has bipolar or schizophrenia or deep depression or suicidal ideation, they're not even being treated for that. They're just being held. And usually they're the people who make the most disturbances, and as a result, they get held longer. So this is a huge reason why legislation needs to change mental illness in the criminal justice system, where they're more educated and have more resources for their providers. We go to the next slide, please. Now this one I found extremely interesting because this shows the sort of the subpopulations in America. For example, the first one is the lesbian, gay, bisexual, etc. Of those, 4.5% living in America's population, 39% reported having mental illness. That's nearly 5.8 million people. Think about that, more than the entire population of Kentucky. And if you notice down there on the bottom of the right-hand side, that 13.4% of the population identifies as Black or African Americans. Of those, over 16% reported having a mental illness in the past year. That's over 7 million people. Think about that. That's more people than the population of Chicago, Houston, and Philadelphia together. I mean, that just gave me cold chills. I can't even imagine that many people not having access, a lot of them, to mental health services. Next slide. And on this slide, you see the health professional shortage areas for mental health. And if you get an opportunity to download this, really look at this. Look how much green is on this map compared to the blue. And usually where the blues are, that's where large hospitals, universities, colleges that have medical schools are located. But the majority of the United States, they just don't have enough mental health services. And that is a shame with us living in the country that we're living in. Next slide. And with this, I want to turn it over to Mariah. So Mariah, if you're there, I'll let you take it from here.
Hi there. Yeah, so I'm Mariah. I grew up in rural New Hampshire and I live in rural New Mexico, which on the map that Ben showed, that's actually first and second place in terms of care in the country. But you know, I grew up. I'm autistic and trans, and have experienced, you know, all of the associated trauma of both of those things. And you know, I've had this lifelong experience of seeing friends who are marginalized just have, you know, experience care as something dangerous often, you know, whether it's people of color who can't include emergency services in their crisis plans for safety, or trans friends who don't seek services because they're afraid of being put with the wrong gender. And I've experienced violence and neglect at the hands of care providers. And I'm currently a holistic practitioner. A lot of my interest is the intersection of individual and social healing. And so I thought it would be really, so we thought it would be really important to share what we mean by some of these definitions. Like, so when we talk about trauma, we mean anything that happens to us that's too big for us to process at the time that it happens. And so this can be sort of like the immediate things you think about in terms of, you know, car accidents or loss of a loved one or experiencing any kind of violence. But it also includes, you know, it also includes structural problems like racism and ableism, and you know, it also, there's also a layer where we all have trauma at this point from, you know, the various crises that are happening, COVID, the environment, you know, and we all live under capitalism and colonialism. So all of these things raise our threshold for the amount of trauma that we experience. And depending on what kind of supports you have, you might experience an event as more or less traumatic. So people who are more marginalized experience more trauma. And we're coming from the angle that trauma often underlies both mental health challenges and substance abuse. So mental health challenges are psychobiological conditions, that means body and mind, that disrupt a person's day-to-day living and their thoughts and feelings and relationships. And it's important to understand trauma as, like, these trauma patterns are adaptations that are our attempt to cope with these various stressors. You know, on some level they make sense, even if they might not be the best solution, or maybe they're an old strategy that's not relevant in present time, or maybe they come from not enough resources. And similarly with substance abuse, that can be a person's best attempt to deal with the neurobiological changes that come from trauma and other stressors such as oppression or physical or emotional pain. And as we see, stigma, punishment, and inappropriate treatment or lack of treatment can intensify trauma, mental health challenges, and substance abuse. And we hold that recovery is possible for people in all of these groups. And next slide. I'm not sure if there's a lag. I'm just gonna, okay, here we go. So in the general population, 15.8% of people have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So there's specific lists. It's been expanded some in recent years, but lists include like death of a parent, incarcerated parent, domestic violence, things like that. So about a sixth of the population has 4 or more of these, which is way too much. But then if we look at that across these different marginalized groups, you know, first of all, so 3/4 of the prison population has 4 or more ACEs. So this is, we'll be talking about the school to prison pipeline and just the ways that we punish trauma in our society. You know, and then kids of color and queer kids and children with disabilities also have extremely high ACE scores. Okay, next slide. And so then I wanted to talk a little bit more about intergenerational and structural trauma. So intergenerational trauma is trauma that is passed down epigenetically, either through alterations of gene expression and developmentally, absorbing our caregivers' responses to stress. So what this means is, again, the more marginalized someone is, if they're coming from a marginalized community, there's already more trauma responses in their bodies that make them more vulnerable to mental health and substance abuse issues. And these trauma patterns are survival tools to manage the dangers and failures of the environment, such as discrimination, police profiling, systematic obstacles to accessing education, medical care, and safe housing, and workplaces, as well as dealing with wealth gaps and the legacies of enslavement, displacement, and dehumanization. So it's important to distinguish these survival adaptations from pathology, victim mentality, culture of poverty, ignorance, laziness, bad choices, or any of the other political justifications for punishing and discarding people who are traumatized. And as with other forms of trauma, given the appropriate safety and material and relational support, it's possible to unwind patterns of intergenerational trauma, so individuals and communities can return to their innate health and thriving. Okay, next slide. And so these next two slides are looking at law enforcement and education in terms of disparities of outcomes for people who interact with law enforcement. So here, as you can see, people with untreated mental health challenges are 16 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement. And 50% of people killed by law enforcement are disabled. And we all think this statistic is way too low, but there's evidence that more than half of disabled African Americans have been arrested by the time they turn 28, which is double the risk in comparison to their white disabled counterparts. So that's the intersectional piece, that the more marginalizations you have, the more dangers you face in trying to just navigate society and health. Okay, next slide. And so then we also will be looking at the disparities in punishment based on marginalization. So Black students are 5 times more likely to be suspended than white students. Black boys are 3 times more likely to be arrested at school than white boys. And so we feel like this is something that really needs to be addressed. And when we're looking at mental health treatment and trauma care, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Like, we really need to look at who is most marginalized and who is most heavily carrying the burdens of marginalization. Okay, next slide. Okay, let's see this. Okay, and then this is just another slide about barriers to pursuing mental health care. Several of these been already mentioned, but this also adds that there's, depending on your race and ethnicity, you may have more barriers in terms of, worrying about discrimination, worrying that the services won't be effective. Okay. And so I'm going to turn it over to Bronwyn again, and you can switch to the next slide.
Okay, I'm sorry. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Okay, good. So we also wanted to share some information about alternative types of treatment because we all work in the realm of, well, several of us work in the realm of peer support, and we also talked about recovery is possible. And because we work in the realm of peer support, we know recovery is possible. I have been working in mental health recovery as a peer support specialist for about 15 years, but prior to that, my life was chaotic with my mental health. And as Ben talked about, the accessibility, the availability, the affordability, I grew up not in urban America, but not in rural America, but urban America in inner city Detroit. And we've talked about the intersectionality of having historical trauma, having layers and layers of trauma. Being a Black woman, growing up in the inner city, my ACEs scores was definitely more than 4. Matter of fact, I scored all 10 on the original ACE study. And after I started my learning about that through recovery, I found that that explains some of my behavior, some of my survival skills, some of the way I interacted with different situations, and what activated trauma responses. But at one point in my life, at a high point in my life, I was struggling with unemployment, lack of education. I couldn't get to college, single mom, and I was having a lot of mental health challenges, and they just kept feeding me pills, which was not allowing me to function as a mother. So that caused more despair. As I've been in recovery, I've learned about peer-run respites. And peer-run respites are programs, and I believe there's about 41 across the country that um, are run by peer support specialists, or peer support specialists work in them. And they are short-term programs where you can go 3 to 7 days and work with someone, get some rest, and figure out your plan next. Many peer run respites are not staffed by, not all of them are staffed by clinical people, so medication is not being forced or being suggested or part of the process. It's a more part of the process. I heard a person call it, it's like just having kitchen table talk, sitting down with someone who can have some empathy, who has some understanding, and who's been down that road, and helping you figure out how to, allowing you to talk your way through it. They're there to listen. They're not there to judge. They're not there to fix you. They're not there to change it for you. They're there to listen to you, and while you figure out how to change it for yourself. So I got involved in peer run respites a couple of years, maybe 3 years back, because when I was going through my crisis, that's the one thing I wish we had. And I'm here in Michigan now. And as you see by this map, we have one that's just getting started, so it's not showing up just yet. But I wish we had had one, because that would have saved me from being one of those 17 million people in the Black community that was struggling with my mental health, but not only struggling with my mental health, one of the 50% of Black people with mental illness that go to prison, because that's where my mental health took me to. It did not get me the help that I needed. The system sent me to prison, where I started to figure it out for myself. Prison didn't help me. I figured it out for myself. Here's some other alternative modalities that's available, that we think needs to be widely taught in the law enforcement communities, in our education communities, and embraced by our legislations and policies. These are trainings and these are skills that we have used as peer supports and practitioners of peer support work that we know that helps. There's the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, which is a self-management toolkit. Once I developed one of those in my life, it helped me be able to recognize when the spiral, when I'm going down or when I'm coming back up, because it's non-linear. We ebb and flow, and to know when we're getting too far off of our, for the lack of a better term, baseline. Then you have the emotional freedom techniques, which is a voluntarily part of our healing. It's taking the pressure points and being able to just use your fingertips to stimulate the energy points, just like you would if you used acupuncture. And acupuncture is another great tool as well. It's been around over 6,000 years. So using the emotional freedom techniques of tapping is great to restore the energy. Emotional CPR is a training, and me and Ben both are trainers in this program of sitting down and just really being able to sit with the person and being present with the person. And it teaches you how to do that and make that connection with them to help revitalize them and bring them back to hope. And then we also have a program called Question, Persuade, and Prefer. And these are gatekeeper type trainings for suicide prevention, which they're a couple hours long, but it's skills and tools that we think law enforcement, educators, and politicians need to know about in order to continue to develop things in America, especially rural America. And I believe this is where we're going to turn it over to Kurt.
I am unmuted. Okay. Can you go one slide up, Bronwyn, please?
Okay, here.
Yeah, that's perfect. Hi,
Gotcha.
I'm Kurt Johnson, filmmaker, and on this project, my job is basically to take everything you just heard, and I know it is a lot of facts and figures, and basically turn it into a 90-minute cohesive story that's both going to educate, entertain, and energize people that are watching it. And because one thing I love about making documentaries, I've been doing this for nearly 30 years, which makes me over 50, but I'm still going. And what I love about documentaries is that people, like, we know that mental health in America sucks. We know it's bad. We know that no matter how much politicians talk about caring, they never seem to care just enough to pass good legislation. Or if it is, it gets repealed. And basically, we get facts and figures thrown at us all the time. So we know there's a problem. But with most social change, what really affects and energizes people are stories. I mean, stories are what affect us all. We react to stories. We are like, that person is like me, that person could be me, or that person is my child, my cohort, my whatever. And that to me is how you can really help make social change, and it's through documentary filmmaking. And I've been lucky enough to work with, in ones with, we dealt with the war on drugs, animal rights movement, and on this one I'm extremely excited because I grew up with a family that suffered from mental illness, didn't know it, in rural America also, and it's just something that's been going on, and I think most people just think it's the way it always is, it's the way it always will be, and it doesn't have to be. So that's my job, is basically to find stories and people to actually tell their stories and share their stories to help educate and just get Americans to realize that there is a solution, and it is a bigger problem than they realize, because most people just don't think about it, or they don't care to think about it until it comes across their doorstep. And that's usually how it works with most people. And that's where, like with a film, if they see it, they might realize, wait a minute, my spouse, brother, sister, they're going through the exact same thing. I didn't know that fell under a mental health issue. I didn't know. And so that's basically my role in this project. And this is just a very, very exciting one for me. And one of the things for me today is I'm reaching out to you, the audience, because we want to put together an advisory committee. Because, like, as a filmmaker, I don't know everything, and I'm an open vessel for learning. And these three amazing people that spoke today before me, they've been teaching me and really helping me understand what the real issue is, what the core of the issue is, and what some of the possible solutions are. But yet we know that we don't have all the answers. So we do want to put together an advisory committee as diverse as possible, of people that can help keep us on track. And basically, like, if we're not covering a specific area that should be, let us know. If we're kind of going off into an area that just doesn't make sense, let us know. And that's the kind of stuff, like, that's going to help make this film really do well, and that's the most important part. And so basically that's what we're looking for. And also, if you have anybody that you think would probably be a good interview, please let us know. You can email us at info@discardedamerica.com. And we do have our website up so already. It's under construction, but you can get an idea of what the project's about, and it's discardedamerica.com. So rather than keep on talking, I'm opening this up to all of you with any questions or comments you may have that we can answer for you. Thanks. Now over to, yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Hello again. So we had a handful of questions that came from the audience members. If you haven't submitted your questions yet, please feel free to do so using the questions button. So I will go ahead and read the first question from Erlinda. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Has the accessibility of resources changed with telemental health?
Okay, is that a Bronwyn question, I think?
So,
Okay.
okay, the question was around telemedicine help. Has the access changed? Yes and no.
Mhm.
It has changed because it has allowed for more people to have access. However, I feel like certain insurances are still not covering that access. And then there are still some people who don't have the technology. There are some rural areas like Upper Michigan here, our Upper Peninsula, where internet service is spotty, hit or miss. So it has improved again for some who are able to access it, but then there's still a huge population that's challenged with accessing it. Now that's my feel around it and my thought from what I've been reading, hearing, and from what I know about being in this environment. Anybody else have anything they want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just add that it's definitely been beneficial for the disabled community. But there's still the issue that the demand way eclipses the availability, and for places like there's been telehealth in a lot of Native communities for a long time, and they're still grossly underserved. So, telehealth is an aspect of accessibility, but we need just a lot more services, period.
Good point. And then you also have the piece of certain communities who still they have a distrust of the services and the systems that's out there because of the intergenerational traumas and the mistreatment of those diverse communities. So they're still distrusting as well, and we see that every day, even with just getting the vaccine. There's so many people out here that are distrusting of the systems. So next question, see?
Is there any research regarding mental health services and individuals with disabilities? Are there considerations, for example, for an individual who is deaf or hard of hearing that needs an ASL interpreter for a counseling or psychiatrist appointment?
That's a great question. That was
Mhm.
several questions.
That's a
Um,
Bronwyn question.
no, that's a team question
That's a
because when
good
I heard
one.
it, I thought about Ben because he's done so much research.
Oh,
I thought
here we
about
go.
Ben
I
and Mariah.
I actually know a few people from Facebook who are either deaf or mute and have to have an assistant when they see a psychiatrist or they see a therapist or any doctor. And there has been some great advancements with that. I know in telehealth, there are companies that actually specifically work with that population. So if they go on, say, a telehealth visit with their therapist, they can also have an interpreter there as well. Not in the same location, but in the same in the same session. So that has become available. I think that's something that has grown out of necessity as more people, especially during COVID, as they get mental health issues like depression, especially. And there's a lot of people I've read that gets a lot of suicidal ideation just from being alone. I mean, I forget if it was Mariah or Baldwin said that we're not meant to be creatures by ourselves. We're meant to be social creatures. We're meant to have people to talk to interact with. And someone that had really experienced that before the COVID crisis, who went into the COVID crisis and had to experience that out of necessity. Yeah, there's a lot of mental health issues that I've read both in journals and just different groups I'm on in social media of people who never thought they would even begin to have a mental illness who has one now. And some of those are disabled, some of those are hard of hearing and mute, and there are companies out there that's starting. Now, this is not in rural areas. Again, this is more in the cities. I know St. Paul has one that does this, that they'll go on to the session with you and they'll interpret for your psychiatrist or your therapist. They have to sign a form, of course, of confidentiality and all that stuff that goes with it, but that service has become available. And like I said, out of necessity. And we're really hoping this documentary shows people that there's a necessity now for people that live in rural America. Next question.
Oh, I'd like to just add, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but there aren't enough services available. You know, and a lot of times as a disabled provider, it's oftentimes, you know, the disability community and providers with disabilities who end up picking up the slack to generate as much accessibility as we can on our own. And there's limits to that. And I can also say, like, as somebody who is autistic, like I've spent a lot of my adulthood without a primary care physician, even with a chronic illness, just because, you know, I've had doctors refuse to see me because I'm autistic. I've had doctors throw me out of their offices because I asked them not to be ableist. So there's technological and like social services support, and then there's also an education piece that's missing for a lot of providers, and I think that's an area where there's a lot of room for growth.
Okay.
Okay, next question. Thank you both.
Thank you so much. And it seems to there's a lot of interest in the chat from folks who are interested in being part of the advisory committee that Kurt mentioned. So if the presenters would be willing to drop your contact information into the chat right now so that people can reach out to you, I think that would be really helpful. And then I will go ahead and move on to the next question. Environment is so important for healing. Have you ever heard of rural mental health retreat centers? That environment and peers do the work if professionals are too busy. Lots of empty land in rural America. I'm wondering what you all think about this.
Mariah, do you have any thoughts around that?
A couple. So I know I know of a couple things in progress. I don't know of anything that's up and running right now, although there may be things that I'm not aware of, but like I know of a place that's somebody who went through the foster care system is trying to develop, and there's a mutual aid network for survivors of human trafficking that's trying to find land, and there's a place in Canada that I know folks are sort of dreaming of a center. But yeah, I mean, I think this would be a fantastic opportunity, and it would also be like economically wonderful for rural communities to have these centers located in the communities.
Ben, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, Mariah has done it perfectly.
Okay. Kurt, do you mind giving us that info at?
Oh, I put that in the chat? I just put it into the chat.
I think it went out just to the organizers and the panels.
Oh, it didn't do the because mine's, oh, okay.
Okay. So go ahead, Steve. What's the next question you have? Thank you, Mariah. Can we? Didn't hear you.
All right. What impact do you think the 988 transition will have on rural communities?
That's a Bronwyn question. Whoa. My personal opinion is, if you are familiar with the suicide hotline that we already have in place and how it is there's a lot of gaps. And what I'm sensing is at this point in time, because I sit on some committees that's helping to put this together on the national level, there's still a lot of gaps. It's like trying to take a wheel that's going flat and inflating it, and the air is still going out the hole. We have not figured out all of the pieces. So I'm thinking and I'm feeling, because it's kind of left up to the individual states to put together their own 988 plan for their state. So there's going to be some disconnect. There's going to be some gaps. And I think it's going to be a work in progress well beyond July. And I know that doesn't put it all in there, but it's going to be it's going to be a work in progress, because yeah, we can't take the same wheel that's shredded and reinflate it. I hope that makes sense. Okay.
Next.
We have any other questions, C?
Yeah, a lot of questions are coming in, and we will do our best to try to get to them. But if we can't, please know that there's the contact information for the presenters in the chat. So the next question
One
is from
question.
If your question doesn't get, I'm sorry, if your question doesn't get answered, you can send it to our information. That way, you know, especially about the documentary stuff like timelines and all that, we can get them answered for you. I'm sorry, Say.
Oh, not a problem. Thank you. The next question is from Kayla, and it reads, how can peer support groups help bring an ease to those who are distrustful in Southwest Virginia specifically, but I think it's a generally applicable question too. How can peer support groups help to bring a sense of ease to those who are distrustful of the larger systems maybe?
So personally, my thought is this, and when I heard that question, I immediately went back to one of the alternatives we talked about around ECPR and RAP. As peer groups and peer support providers, having the skills that's offered in those two ways of sitting down, because both of those two to me were empowering tools for me and allowing me to get my voice back, because I had allowed the system to have a voice for me, and providers to tell me what I needed, instead of realizing that I had a PhD in Bronwyn. My PhD is in Bronwyn. You know, I am the person that has the diagnosis, and I'm the person that best knows me from head to toe. I've lived with me 60 years, so I know, you know, so but having someone to help me sit down and do those show me about RAP plans. There was a book a long time ago I learned called Pathways to Recovery, and that let me know that there's going to be different roads. And then being able to take the emotional CPR and learning how to just sit with a person and listen, and allowing myself to share with them what their story is making me feel. So when someone shares something to me and I can and it resonates with me, being able to tell them, wow, I felt that really deeply, that really resonated with me, and telling them how that made the connection. that starts those walls to coming down. Also, just walking alongside of them in that journey and allowing them to get their voice back, so that when they are with providers, they don't feel threatened and bullied into something that they're not comfortable with, and being able to open up and share. That's my thought. That's my opinion. Anybody else has some thoughts and opinions, but because I know you all do.
Ben, do you have anything?
One thing I did want to say was when I first became a peer support specialist, I really didn't know much about it. I had my MBA, I was in a horrible accident and had to start my life all over. And I did that as a peer support specialist. And I was working in a residential facility, and there was a young trans man that came in who was very suicidal. He had been told his whole life what he should and shouldn't do, and he was just tired of it. He just wanted to end his life. And me being able, like Bronwyn said with the ECPR, to sit and listen to that person, hear what they had gone through. But I think most importantly for him, for me to tell him that I went through the exact same thing. I wasn't trans. Oh my God, what he was feeling about wanting to end his life, I had been there. And we sat there and we talked for, I know, at least 2 hours about that. And when he got finished, he was said, "Thank you, man. I didn't think anybody else out there knew what I was going through." So that's where peer support really comes into play. And I think it could really come into play in rural communities where people's told, just get over it. You know, that's just the devil in you. I mean, I was told that my whole life. And when you're told that, you need somebody to come along and reach out a hand and say, I know what you're going through. I've been there. And like Bronwyn said with emotional CPR, sometimes just being able to listen without giving any, you should do this, you should do that. Well, why don't you do this? Well, why don't you do that? But rather hearing that made me really emotional. You're going through a lot right now. And just giving that person a voice, giving that person a person again. Because I know as someone who's had mental illness, you lose that. Sometimes you lose your identity completely. And it's at those points you want to end your life. It's those points when mental illness gets at its worst. And it's at those points that I think peer support could play such a significant role, not only in, you know, where it's at now in urban areas and in cities, but in those rural farm communities. Just to have somebody take you by the hand and say, it's going to be okay. I've been there too. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever done in my life. And I think since then, it's the most beautiful thing I ever did in my life was help that person. Because everyone else in there was social workers, and there was a psychiatrist that came through, a psychologist that came through, but nobody listened to him. And I did. And because of that, he left with a plan. He left with a rat plan. And he left with something in his heart that says, I can still be me. I am a person. And I still talk to that person sometimes on Facebook, and he's still there. He's transitioned completely, and he's as happy as he can be. And I don't want the thanks for it, but I'm grateful that I was able to be there like that. And people don't have to have a college education to be a peer. You just need, really, you just need a history with mental illness or with emotional problems. So to that question, I think, yeah, peer support would be amazing in rural areas, and it could help so many people. So yeah.
Thank you, Ben. You gave me
Thanks for the
chills.
question.
You gave me chills. Thank you. And because basic human need, we have some basic needs. We have basic needs to be social. We have basic need to be heard, and we have a basic need to be understood. And a lot of my challenges came from the fact that I wasn't being heard and I wasn't being understood. You know, when I went into a doctor's office, they weren't hearing me. they were already formulating, they weren't using good listening skills. And I teach this in some of the classes. Good listening skills is listening to understand, not listening to reply. So if I'm sitting there and I'm really listening to you, I'm understanding you. But if I'm already trying to get the answer in my head before you finish talking, then I'm just listening to reply. There's a difference. See, next question.
Wait, I actually
Mariah had something. I'm sorry.
I have many thoughts on this. I'm going to try to boil it down to 3. So I think I feel like peer support makes a huge difference in terms of bringing equity and healing to the system. Like, professionalism is very centered around whiteness and normativity. And so the people who get to be practitioners, tend to be the people with the least marginalizations. Like for myself, like I'm very aware of how much my whiteness has supported me and, sort of cushioning me from some of the impacts of the other kinds of marginalization I experience. And I'm here doing this work because I want to make sure that like everybody can go through the doors to healing. So I think peer support can just bring in a very different element and help people feel seen, like Bronwyn's talking about. And and that's very empowering. Like also what she's saying about like just listening. So much of the medical model is I'm gonna be the expert. I'm gonna do to you. I'm gonna tell you what to do. I'm gonna fix you. And like that's not a fundamentally empowering process that people really need when they're struggling with mental illness and substance abuse and things like that. And then the third piece, we don't have it listed on like the specific modalities because there's so many, but there's a lot of like indigenous healing practices, curanderismo, ancestral wisdom. There's a lot of things that should be recentered that are actually abundant in rural communities, and they can be delivered by the community. They often are for people who are concerned about the economic costs. Like there's it can be a lot easier to take an herb or talk to somebody than go through very expensive forms of treatment. So anyway, that's my 3 cents.
Thank you, Mariah, and I apologize.
Thank you.
And yeah, that's the guru.
Okay, the next question is from Jason. What are your thoughts on how we can get mental health services into the rural areas, especially when there are great distances to urban centers where most mental health professionals are located?
Good question. And I think that's part of what we want to journey down with this documentary, is to find out how to get more services in there. I think, first of all, I think providers are not going to those areas because they can't make money. There's no funding. So we have to figure out how to get legislation and policy changes to get more funding into those areas, to be able to pay people to want to come to those areas. We got to incentivize, providers. And as a community, developing and training more peer supports in the community to kind of help bridge the gap to the providers, so that there are some people there, even if it means putting some respites in those areas, which would provide somewhere for someone to go to get some support. If you got to go 45 minutes to the nearest provider, how come you can't put a central location, like a respite with peer support 20 minutes away? That's just something that just kind of comes to my mind as I'm hearing this question. But there's more ways to explore this, and I'm hoping that with this advisory team that we get as we're putting this documentary together, these are more questions that we can start to answer there, because like Kurt said a little while ago, we don't have all the answers, but we see the challenge, and it's going to take a team to tackle this. Mariah, Ben.
Well, the only thing I'll add, Braun, is, you spoke of peer support, maybe respites 15, 20 minutes away when the provider's 45 minutes away. I think one of the things that really needs to happen in some of these communities where there's a lot of stigmatization, a lot of discrimination, is to somehow find a way to alleviate that. Because even if you get a psychiatrist or some other provider in a rural area, if people are too fearful or untrustworthy to go, they're not going to get any patients and they're going to leave very soon. So I think maybe it is a process, and that's really what I'm hoping this documentary will do, is to show that process, to show that in some of these communities where mental health is just a negative, something you don't talk about, that it can become destigmatized and the discrimination can be lifted so that more mental health providers will want to go into those communities because there'll be more people to treat. And I think that's one of the things that's lacking right now. All right.
Yeah, and I don't think this is a situation that has a simple solution. There's so many layers that have to do with, like, how we're actually organizing as a society. And, like some of the pieces, like, okay, so like, what if we had just a lot more availability so people in rural communities would even realize, like, oh, like, this is something that I could do. Like, I could be somebody who's supporting the wellness in my community. And, treating young people like they matter, and exposing them to these different possibilities. In New Mexico, we say that our biggest export is our youth. And it's so sad because we live in a beautiful state with really strong traditions, and, the money goes to Los Alamos National Labs. It doesn't go to the schools. I mean, that's the, anyway. But yeah, so I think there's just a lot of different pieces, and I think it's really more of a question of who do we want to be than like, oh, like this little program is going to fix this issue.
Thank you both. Any other questions?
Yep. The next question, give me 1 second. I have to scroll up a little bit. What else do you envision for what mutual aid networks for supporting each other socially and emotionally might look like in rural settings in particular?
Great question. Again, I'm thinking peer programs, peer drop-ins, peer respites, some sort of center where people can come together without the stigma, like Ben was talking about, because stigma is huge. And in rural areas, everybody knows everybody, and everybody's in everybody's business. I mean, it's just how it is. It happens in the big city, but it happens more in the smaller communities, But being able to break down some of that stigma and setting up some community places where people can go and get peer support. Just be able to go in and sit down and talk with one another. You heard me mention kitchen table talk. Well, what do you do when you meet with your favorite girlfriend at the Starbucks, or your favorite guy, or your cousin or somebody, and you just go to a Starbucks with a friend? What do? You just sit there, have coffee, and you chat about everything. Well, why come we can't have some central places like that? Drop-in centers, respites. Now that's my thought. Take it away, Ben or Mariah.
I totally agree with you, 100%.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why, I mean, I feel like top tier is still not, like, that still feels like a really low bar. But I think one of the reasons why New Hampshire is one of the upper rated ones is, when when Reagan cut all the mental health funding in the 80s and everybody just got turned out of the hospital systems, a friend of mine was instrumental in constructing community centers in every county in New Hampshire. And you know, and he's sadly since passed on from suicide. You know, he didn't have the support he needed, even though he, you know, brought all this help to the community. But, you know, things like that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, next question. I think we may have time for one or two more questions, huh? Okay.
So, as someone working with mentally ill people in the criminal justice system, what would those of you with similar histories have wanted or needed from a clinician? And this is a question from Lucy.
Thank
I
you,
don't know if
Lucy.
you
I
want
think that I definitely know that's a Bronwyn question. So there's layers. There's definitely layers to that. Right now they've somehow or another developed what they call what is it called? Mental health court. Mental health courts are available in a lot of different areas now. Um, but again, what is happening and what I found happened, because for me is, again, Ben nailed it. I had listened to so many people telling me what I needed and what I had to do and what I should do. I had no identity when I ended up in prison. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know how I couldn't even begin to realize how my life had spiraled to that point, and gotten the sentence that I got for a first time offender. But again, there was no hospitals, and the hospital policies were meant to keep me there until I was able to go before a judge. So it was just messy. Anyway, what I needed from a clinician, and fortunately I got it, was they asked me two questions that changed my whole entire life. One question, the first question she asked me was, "Who are you?" Because I didn't and that's when I realized I didn't have a identity of my own. I labeled, I'm this person's mother, I'm this person's daughter, I'm this person's wife, I'm this person's this, and I'm this, and I connected it to things that I was doing, but I wasn't connecting it to me and my personality and my characteristics of me. And she said, no. Who are you? What are the things that you're good at? What are the things that you like? So she helped me identify my strengths. And then she asked me if she helped me identify things that I liked or what was good in my life. And I sat back and I thought about it. I have 3 children, and the competition in our household was who could get the highest grades in school, because they were all on honor roll. So that was the competition. Who could come home with the highest grade point average? That was competition in my house for my 3 children. So what was the common denominator there? It was me. I was the teacher at home. I was the teacher before they got to school, before they started school, because they all started school on a higher level than most of their classmates. So I had to realize, wow, that's a gift that I have. Next thing was, people like to talk to me. People were drawn to me, just drawn to talk to me. So I had to realize, okay, something about me brings healing and comfort. So that's who I am. I'm an educator. I'm a healer. I bring comfort. I'm strong. I'm wise. I'm smart. And I had to, that was the first thing. Then the second thing was asking me, what were my dreams? And my answer to her was, I don't have dreams anymore for myself. My dreams are that my children will be successful and continue college and blah, blah, blah. And she said, well, you had dreams before you had children, didn't you? Light bulb went off and lit up the whole room, because it's, yes, I did. In high school, I had dreams of what I wanted to do in life, travel, places I wanted to go, things I wanted to see. And she said, so what's stopping you? Oh my God. I was the only thing stopping me from still reaching my dreams. Just because I became a mother, a wife, and all those other things didn't stop me from reaching my dreams. So that helped me find my identity. And once I got my identity back, I've been moving forward and I haven't stopped since. So that's what I needed, was those two questions to revitalize the hope in me. And that happened in a prison the first year I was in prison. And then I had to start layering, okay, you just got labeled with this mental health, this, and this. How did that come about? Where did that come from? And I had to dig deep. And I had to start peeling away those layers and looking at some of that trauma. And it's taken me 25 years to peel away all of the layers of trauma because I'm still peeling them away and trying to heal from them. But I did it step by step, a little at a time. I hope that answered your question. If that didn't, and if you need to reach out, I think the PowerPoint is coming out to everybody that was on this site. And in the PowerPoint, there's our emails and links to how to reach us, or you can send the questions to the piece where that Kurt put on, and I will reach out. I try to answer all my emails. It might take me a minute, but I will answer it if that didn't answer your question.
Oops. And also in the PowerPoint presentation, sorry, we actually have on the links to some of the works. So for those of you that don't have Netflix, Hulu, or Showtime, we've got links of my previous documentaries like The Thoth that won the Oscar. So that way it kind of gives you an idea of the quality we're going to be putting out with this documentary. Because I know there's a lot of documentaries out there, and it's hard to cut through with a lot of them, but you'll see with ours, we're going to be, you'll be hearing about it and you will be seeing it.
And if I'm not mistaken, this recording may go on to the National Coalition's website.
I believe so. And I will definitely check in with you afterwards to make sure that everyone has access to the recording and the slides as well.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. That was just awesome.
Thank you. Thank you for taking your lunch, brunch, or morning breakfast. Thank you.